Welcome to the Jackson Center. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. This, although not technically a Jackson Center event, we are thrilled to be hosting this book launch for Walt and the first Counter Spy. I am going to introduce Walt's daughter, Kate, to give the more formal welcome, but I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for being here. A couple of announcements in case you weren't downstairs. The food will stay available after the show as well. You can still purchase a book, and Walt will still sign books afterwards as well. So just wanted to let you know that if you did not have the opportunity to do that beforehand, you've not missed your shot. Kate, with that, please.
I did want to just say a few things by way of welcome. So many of you, I've heard your names so many times. It's so nice to get to meet you in person. But I also wanted to explain sort of why we're having a party, why we're celebrating, because if you know both Kay and my dad, Walt, you probably know they're not the kind of people who'll be like, hey, let's have a party for me, right? That's not their style. But there are a couple things I think that are really worth celebrating about this book. The first is that we do live in a time when people are encouraged to speak their truth, and that's good in a lot of ways, but what I think this book does is it highlights something really important about what that means. And when you think about someone like Kay, no one would have blamed her had she said, you know, I don't need to write that book. You know, I can do something else with my time. I can make more beautiful stained glass art. I can do all kinds of things. But she was so compelled that she needed to tell this story that she was willing to devote an enormous amount of effort to doing it. And I think that's an important thing about the truth, that when we're committed to it, we don't let it die. And then on the other hand, you know, you look at my dad, those of you, you all know my dad, he's incredibly imaginative, but he's also a scientist. And what you get in this book is not just an imaginative story, but the evidence to go behind it that says you get to read the imaginative story, and then you get to decide. Right? You get to decide which parts make the most sense to you, which parts you'd like to know more about. And I think that's an important thing about the truth too, right? That we do use our minds to interpret the world, but there's evidence we can look to. And I don't know that many books that do that. Usually you get one or you get the other. And so when you take that together, I think we have a lot to celebrate. And then the last thing is this. So in my field, we do a lot of work on what makes the expenditure of time or money meaningful to people. And the two most robust findings are, first, experiences do more for you than goods, and things that connect people do more than things that divide people. And I think a book is inherently an experience that we get to share, and this, the fact that you guys are here, is what makes this as valuable as it is. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to my dad to kick us off.
I work very, very hard to keep up with my kids, to catch up with them. Thank you, Kate, very much. And thank you so much for all of you being here. I'm really deeply honored by your showing up here. This has been a remarkable experience. I've heard a million people say, I want to write a book about this or that someday. If you decide to, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be an experience like you've never had. Kay and I met about 5 years ago, and that was the beginning of a remarkable relationship. And Lee is here now, too. So between Lee and, there's Lee, Lee and Kay, this has been an opportunity to get to know somebody at a level I've known very few people. But right now, what I want to do is acknowledge folks who are here today who worked with us and contributed in some way. And when I mention the folks who are here, I'd love it if you'd either raise your hand or something. And I want to be sure everybody gives you a round of applause before we're done, because you really helped make this happen. So I'm going to start by reading just a short paragraph on the acknowledgement sections so you understand why we appreciate so much what so many of you have done to help. By the time we started to write about America's first civilian counter spy, Kay Haas had spent many years amassing notes, clippings, volumes of declassified FBI documents, and a small library of books that rarely contained more than just glimmers of her father's role in the spy sagas of World War II. His story was kept a secret on purpose. 75 years later, it is not too late to reveal the secrets. But Kay knew there was more to tell than historians yet knew. She and her father had lived it, First-person testimony of such events was rapidly disappearing beyond the horizon of living memory, and Kay began to fear that her father's story would soon fade into history's night as well. And she had a promise to keep, the promise she made her father on his deathbed: tell the world about my life. Her experiences in keeping that promise, however, had revealed a complex tale like Larry Haas's, spanning years, myriad places, unlikely to succeed through long-distance impersonal relationships with writers and researchers. So our first acknowledgement goes to the Rotary Club International of Jamestown, New York. That's where Kay and I met. And Lee. And the Rotary has a 4-way test, and part of it says the Rotary will help build better friendships. So we decided that would be a good place to start. And then I want to thank, I don't think there's anyone here from there, but it's the Niagara Aerospace Museum in Niagara Falls. If you have an opportunity to visit, it is a remarkable place. And there you will see America's first jet engine that Larry Haas worked on. You can actually touch it. It's a remarkable place, and there are people there who still knew Larry. And then I'm thanking my friend, excuse me, Dick Harms, longtime Bell engineer whose team designed and built the ascent engine that lifted Apollo 11's crew off of Tranquility Base on the moon on July 21st, 1969. That night, Dick's team notched another of Bell's milestones in flight in the same spirit that Bell and GE team with Larry Haas had only a scant quarter century before. Michelle is here somewhere, right? There you are. Okay. Michelle tells a story about how her father and their team sat there turning blue, holding their breath until that crew got off the moon. But Bell is a very remarkable industry, part of the history of this book and this country. I'm also thanking Jack Barsky, who is also not here. He wrote a book called Deep Undercover. He had been a spy for the Soviets for 10 years and finally flipped to the FBI. He contributed greatly to understanding the spycraft that went into this book. I appreciated him. Also, David Chambers, the grandson of Whittaker Chambers, whose story you may remember from the world of spycraft. David also contributed very kindly to this book. John Earl Haynes, Catherine Sibley, 2 historians who've written widely on this subject. But once again, in every case, even people who wrote 300 or 400-page books had a couple of paragraphs about Larry Haas because the secret had been so well kept on purpose. I'm also thanking a friend that not many of you here would know. I know Kay will. I'm describing him as a renowned bibliophile, my friend Eric Bjorn. And thank you, too, to Bev Johnson. I don't know if Bev is here at Quick Solutions downtown. When we had to get manuscripts ready to be sent out in a hurry, there aren't too many places that will print up 400 pages of manuscript for you in 2 minutes' notice. So we appreciated that. We're also thanking Kay's sister, Judy, her son, Denny, cousins, Caroline, nephew, David McMahon. David McMahon is a name you may know from the Central Park Five. He is the documentarian who, with his wife, produced that amazing story. Thank you to Dr. Catherine Lamberton and my son, Dr. Bill Pickett. We're also thankful to Greg for making this all happen. And finally, and certainly not last, I'm thanking thanking Nancy, who is here. If I think it was hard to spend 5 years writing a book, it was even harder putting up with it. But Nancy has a God-given talent to hear the characters in what I write actually live and breathe. And her constant support and feedback during the job really helped make it all happen. There's no other way it would have, so thank you. Thank you, Greg.
In order to frame the interview, we are going to show a 6-minute excerpt of an interview I did with Kay Marker. I knew her as Kay Marker. Kay Haas, which was done in 2013. Many moons ago, it seems like. There's a long version, which we'll post sometime. But here's just the first time we've really shown a couple of clips, and you'll get a chance to hear from Kay herself.
Had a very nice profession. She was a concert pianist. She was self-trained. She never had a lesson, but she was one of those child prodigies, and she was excellent. She had her own concert hour when she was 17 years old, weekly. So that was quite amazing. And anyways, she got a job working for Woody Herman.
Sure.
Do you remember him?
Absolutely.
On his very first band that he had. She was his pianist. Yeah, and she loved it. It was a part-time job she could do while she went to college, and she did that. And he actually fell in love with her. So in the meantime, she'd met my father, who also fell in love with her. So he decided he'd better marry her really quick. So she did marry my father. Got a home in what was a building up suburb in Buffalo, Snyder, near Amherst. So we lived there, and I started school in 4th grade. Well, that was a terrible thing, because the teacher didn't like me because I was so dumb. I didn't even know how to tell time. My mother, probably because she was so distraught all the time, never bothered to try to teach me. So I literally started with no knowledge. I could read badly. That was it. And I was so embarrassed because the teacher knew I was dumb. And she would deliberately put a math problem on the board and ask me to come up and do it. I couldn't do it. I didn't even know what it was. Well, she was horrible. She used to beat me because I was so stupid. What are you doing here? You're so stupid. You don't have any right to be in this class, you know. Made me feel terrible. And then the kids called me retard. That was worse. And my parents finally had to have my class changed, and that worked out a little bit better, but catching up was really rough. But I did it. When you're young, you can do anything. We had a buffet, and the dishes are kept and stuff, you know what I'm talking about. There was a drawer in the center that had silverware and stuff in it. And she said to me, "Come here, I have something to show you." And she opened it up, and there was a pistol. She said, "It's loaded, and if you need it, use it." Well, not too long after that, I found out she not only had that one that she kept in her bedroom when we moved into her house, into her bedroom drawer, very accessible, but also she kept one in her purse. And we were never safe, even for a minute. The FBI, every night, sat in front of our house, all for 4 years. My life as a teenager, which was constantly protected, could have no friends, couldn't go to a friend's house, couldn't invite a friend to my house, couldn't participate in school activities. And over the 4 years of high school, there were, I think, a total of 7 episodes where they tried to kill me.
Sure.
Yeah. And some of them were really nasty. They didn't succeed. But they did try it in the worst way.
Yeah.
They wanted to kill me so that I was either at home or someplace in that area where my family would find me, and my parents would suffer, you know, at seeing me killed, and like coming in my bedroom, finding me dead in my bed. You know, that was the way to do it.
So this would have been the revenge that they wanted to extract.
Yeah, yeah. I will kill you in the worst way.
Yeah.
Okay, that went on for 4 years. I got to tell you about the bugs in our house.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the kind that crawl. We built that house, and immediately he knew that we were going to be under surveillance. The FBI had them under surveillance, so they knew every move that the that the Russians were going to move. But in our house, it was a big house. There were bugs in every room. My father knew where everyone was. And so when we had to have a conversation about anything like that, pertaining to that, we had to go and stand by the front door in the hallway. It's the only place they couldn't find a place to put a bug. There was no closet there. There was nothing way to hide it. Yeah, but we spent our whole time, all the way through, living with bugs.
You mentioned your dad knew Oppenheimer, Bob Oppenheimer.
Yes, they became very, very close friends. In fact, Bob Oppenheimer, during the 4 years of high school, visited us frequently. And I think he even stayed overnight a few times.
No kidding.
Yeah. He and my dad just had so much in common. They were both brilliant men.
Yeah.
And my dad just loved him. He said he was just a fine man. Yeah. And you know who else he really befriended was Richard Nixon. And he told me that Richard Nixon, even though he was probably, I don't even know if he was in the House of Representatives at that time, or probably was, that he worked really hard to assist him in this endeavor, and that he probably worked the hardest of anybody.
I love this crowd because most of them would know who Woody Herman was. You know, you could do this at high school, and you would have lost everybody there. So I interviewed Kay, and again, to me, it's Kay Marker. And full disclosure, she had previously married into our family, my family, and so reunions and other stuff. So it was Jerry and Kay Marker until Jerry passed away, and of course, married Lee. So there, I got to know, and she never really mentioned this story that you've turned into a book until one time she came to the office and explained the story and wanted me to film her. And there's an hour-plus interview of Kate so she could get it out. And I must tell you, I felt it was not necessarily believable, to be honest with you. And I'm just curious, when you first met Kay 5 years ago and sort of went through the same interview process, because you have to in your business, what was your immediate reaction?
I have to say I agreed with you. It was so phenomenal. I said, how could these things happen to one person and one person do all these things? But she intrigued me because the stories were just remarkable. And very soon I was able to look at the documentation she had. It was in a big cardboard box, 400 or 500 pages of documents, declassified documents from the FBI. Started going through them, and one after another I found out that the stories she told you and the stories she told me were really only half the story. It was even more remarkable than she said. And so, you know, when you meet somebody who says, they tried to kill me 7 times, you want to write the book, you tend to want to say yes.
So you hear that, you hear the number 7, she starts, and then you actually start groping around, looking at the evidence. But from your skill set and background, what is it that you brought to the table? I mean, if Kay sought you out, I know that because we talked about it, to give you a sense of confidence that if the story is correct, I can do it.
Well, actually, we were introduced by, Russ Dietrich, because Russ had introduced me to Jim Roselli, and I had done Jim's book before. And I knew that I could put the story together from the kind of pieces that they had. But I have a background in science, too, and to be able to read the inside story of how America's very first jet aircraft was created, I knew it was going to be absolutely fascinating because the science behind what they did was cutting edge.
So part of what you had to do due diligence is dig in, and I know from personal experience, she was digging hard. She was indefatigable when it came to FOILs, FBI, and other governmental agencies. She didn't give up because there's many reasons to give up. But beyond that, now you have to dig into other areas. But what was the process?
That's very interesting. Actually, early on in the process, I found what you just said. I found innumerable letters requesting information from stone walls, frankly. And it takes an awful lot of courage on the part of somebody like Kay to try to track down her own story. So she had given me a huge head start. And I started simply by reading every page of those documents. It was a very, very long process. And FBI writing style within their reports could seem very dry, but I found it incredibly exciting because we were actually reading firsthand accounts by people who were there. So it just started with a lot of reading and an awful lot of research because even the terminology had to be understood. I think Kay didn't even understand some of the material she had. So there's a lot of research that went in. And I started reading historical accounts around her father's life. And over and over and over again, I found the little hints that nobody had ever dug into. And then when you find something like it, you just can't stop, you know.
Was there an aha moment where you're digging along and you turn to your wife and say, we got something here?
Quite a few. However, the title of the book, The First Counter Spy, it was probably the thing that really, really got me because I was just reading and read some FBI documents even after the events in the book. But J. Edgar Hoover was being prepped by his staff because a House committee, the Joint Committee on Un-American Activities, House Committee on Un-American Activities Committee, they were just about to dive into this case 3 years after the war. The war was over, but in Washington there was still plenty of blame to be placed by people who wanted to place blame on the war was won, but battles had been lost. So it became clear that J. Edgar Hoover, 3 years later, might not remember everything that had happened. So his deputy wrote him a memo saying, "You will recall that this was our first attempt to recruit an American civilian as a counter-spy against the Soviets, against anyone." And when I read that, it echoed in my mind for a moment before I even realized what I read. I said, this was the first ever. And the FBI had absolutely no experience in running a counter-spy. They didn't know what to do or how to do it. And there was nobody around to show it to them.
And put it into context, here's a guy, Larry Haas, born 1917. He was a milkman and finessed. Your story says he finessed his way to being an engineer, deemed an engineer, I should say, better term, deemed an engineer at Bell.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit about that finesse?
Well, I called him an honest con man. When you read the book, you'll see that his family had a very, very interesting way of using the truth. And He was, however, a very, very ethical, very honest, and very patriotic man. So he was not about to let an opportunity like aircraft get by him, but he basically told the biggest lie of his life and turned himself into one of America's top aircraft scientists. And I don't want to give out too many spoilers here, but he actually had...
Buy the book, buy the book.
Buy the book, buy the book. He taught himself aeronautical engineering from the ground up by breaking into the Bell Aviation Library at night and reading. Within 3 months, he had learned it so well that he was teaching aeronautical engineering to Bell's own scientists. And he was just, well, people argue about whether or not photographic memory actually exists, but he had as close to it as you could get. And I believe Kay had a bit of that in her genes as well because of the details she remembers. So, yeah, he taught himself. And within just a couple of years, well, that's the absolute top of the list, top of the world's scientists in aeronautical engineering.
So he's at Bell, and he's working on non-prop jet engine.
Right.
That was the big new thing that was hoped to be developed. And the Russians, now, this is like 42, 43,
Right.
had a contract. You kind of wrap your head around this. So you wrap your head, so they were allies. They're on our team. They have a
Yes.
contract with Bell, and they sent over this guy named Shevchenko,
Shevchenko, yeah,
as a representative of the company, a Russian company that's buying it.
right.
Sort of be in-house, quality control guy. And you want to give us a little teaser from there?
Sure.
Again, read the book.
Well, the teaser was everybody knows that the Soviets wanted the secret to the atomic bomb. And thousands of books have been written about that espionage escapade, how they stole the bomb secrets. But you have to think about, what if you knew how to build an atomic bomb and you got your little, Heath kit and put one together in your basement? It's not going to do you any good unless you can deliver it someplace, because if you set it off in your basement, it's going to mess the place up. So the Soviets needed a way to deliver that bomb. The only rockets around were the German V-2s, and they only traveled a couple hundred miles at best. The best way to deliver an atomic bomb would be a jet aircraft. So priority number 2 for Soviet espionage during the Second World War was to gain the secrets of jet aviation. And Bell and General Electric were building at the highest possible level America's first jet aircraft. So this guy Shevchenko, himself an aeronautical engineer, trained in Moscow, was at Bell. His job was to buy P-39s and P-63s and to steal everything else he could. You have to understand that during the Second World War, the Soviets purchased perfectly legally 100,000 U.S. patents and sent them home and never gave credit or royalties to anybody. But what they couldn't buy, they wanted to steal. So that was Shevchenko's job. And by the way, excuse me for interrupting, just parenthetically, I forgot to mention one very, very important person here, speaking of aircraft. John Watkins. John, are you here? Yes. John, I forget how many times you said you landed on aircraft carriers, is a career pilot who really helped me understand the aircraft I was writing about, and I appreciated that. So John is one of the other people I wanted to acknowledge. But the first jet aircraft were something that Larry knew how to build. And he was the interface between GE and Bell. Bell built an airframe, and GE built the engine. And Larry's job was to marry the two. So he worked on both sides of that simultaneously. Very few other people did at that time.
So Shevchenko is there legally, embedded, if you will, in Bell.
Right.
He's working for a company called Amtorg,
Amtorg.
which is a legitimate Russian, part of the aviation department of the Soviet Purchasing Committee. So he's there, he's in the business, and there's Larry, and they actually meet, at some point,
Yeah.
socially. Then what happens?
Well, they met, and they didn't really like each other at first, at all. I can't remember the Russian phrase. I wish I could, because I'm sure I'd like to use it a few times. But the English translation is that Shevchenko considered Larry a useful idiot. And Larry didn't like Shevchenko because he thought he was somewhat of a stuffed shirt. But they did not know at that time when they first met at the plant that they were going to have to become friends. And if you're going to be in espionage, many times you have to befriend somebody if you want to get to know something that they know. And the Russians, I was told by some FBI agents I worked with on this book, are masters of a technique called the long seduction. And you're not going to get any secrets out of somebody unless they know you well, unless they like you, unless you like them, unless you're almost intimately related as friends. And Shevchenko's job was to ply this technique to get Larry to give him secrets. But the Soviet line on that during the Second World War was this: we have a war because of the generals and the politicians. They're all the same. Mussolini's no different from Winston Churchill. Hitler's no different from Roosevelt. They're just politicians, and they get the generals to do their dirty work. We, however, are scientists. We're superior to all of them. We should be running the world, so let's leave all those politicians and generals to their dirty work. Let's just cooperate and make it a better world through science. And Larry almost bought that, because back in those days, communism was considered the coming new age of the world. It was going to save the world. Everyone would work for everyone else's benefit. Everyone would benefit by their work. So it was an interesting tussle, really.
So Shevchenko is doing this slow dance with Larry Haas. Larry Haas is similarly doing that, but at some point he decides the information that is being attempted to be gleaned from him, or that he's getting from Shevchenko, he kind of turns on him.
Yes, but there's an interesting technique, and if you watch enough cop shows on TV, I'm sure you know this technique. The FBI had been watching Shevchenko since he got to the States, simply because you had to keep track of these people. They were our allies, but J. Edgar Hoover was almost unique in not trusting the communists, so they kept an eye on him. And one day they saw Larry and Andre out to dinner one night, just kind of getting to know each other. And the FBI agents went to visit Larry and said, "You know, Larry, we saw you consorting with somebody we believe to be a spy. You could be in big trouble. If we report that, you're out of work. On the other hand, if you'd like to help us." It's a classical fork. And they thought they were going to have to coerce Larry into cooperating. But in fact, Larry had an allergy to being manipulated by anybody. So he decided if he was going to be manipulated, he'd rather join forces with the FBI than with a Soviet who was probably a spy.
So the FBI sort of has a file on Shevchenko, watching him. Over here, Haas is from Bell, sort of consorting with Shevchenko. The FBI and Shevchenko meet. They come to an understanding. And there's an information flow that starts now which has the FBI fingerprints on it.
Right.
Without giving away state secrets, I don't want to give you away, read the book.
Is there a book to read?
So give a little teaser on that?
Yeah. It was interesting. As I said, the FBI didn't really know how to do this themselves. And Shevchenko's technique, the technique of the slow seduction, is to first get you to just help out with something totally innocent. You know, can you help me just understand a little bit more about the way Americans build airplanes? That assembly line that Larry Belt built, that's wonderful. Can you help me understand the assembly line a little bit better? So the idea was to get Larry used to just divulging things that anybody could learn in a magazine. But after a while, he started to say, look, this just might bend a little bit of a rule. Not bad, just a little bit. But you know me, I would just really like to understand this better. So the idea is to get somebody to divulge something that might just bend a rule a little bit. But then they ask you to, that was great stuff. Can you bend the rule just a little bit for me and get me a little bit more? And before long, you've bent enough rules that they can bend you over the barrel and say, you know what? You are now guilty of espionage, and it's a felony, so now I own you. You can get me anything I want. Well, Larry was right in the middle of that, and the agents explained to him where he was in that process, and they said, okay, Larry, get seducted. Go ahead. Let him con you into giving him secret stuff, because then we'll catch him red-handed. Neat trick. It might have been a little bit of entrapment, but I think they were beyond that point. However, in order to give Shevchenko anything good, he had to get permission from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from Washington, from the FBI, and nobody could decide what he could be given. On the one hand, if it contained real secret information, there was a chance he might have gotten away with it. On the other hand, if it contained faked information that was supposed to look good, he might have understood it was a fake and just blown the whole works. So that started a round of passing a hot potato around at the very highest levels of government and the U.S. military. So it got very, very, very dicey.
To the point of, at some point, Shevchenko is accused of espionage and is indicted.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't quite indicted. As a matter of, excuse me. On the cover of the book, if you've got your bifocals on, one of the things that the publisher did is put a piece on the front of a headline that indicted publicly, although not legally. The trial was done in the public opinion, not in the courtroom. But if there are any historians here, you can read the fine print here. You can read the beginning of the article. It's by Howard Rushmore. And Howard Rushmore, at one point, had been a devoted, outspoken communist journalist, shilling for the Communist Party. But then when Stalin signed a pact with Hitler, a non-aggression pact, American communists felt that Stalin had betrayed them all. And Rushmore flipped. He said, I'm going to forget that. I'm not going to like my friend Uncle Joe Stalin anymore. Now I'm going to like the Americans. So he flipped. And he became a very useful tool where the so-called unauthorized leak, you ever heard that in the news? Something leaked. I think we've heard, Greg, I think we've heard about leaks in the news lately, haven't we, having to do with the court. One of the smaller courts, the Supreme Court, I think it is. Yeah.
Minor stuff.
Yeah, minor stuff, unauthorized leaks. But it's good if you're going to unauthorize a leak so that nobody knows who did it. It's good to have a journalist who wants to publish it. So Howard Rushmore was very useful in that respect. He, however, also proved himself to be something other than a completely upstanding journalist, because he was eventually convicted of murdering his wife, and then he committed suicide. So credibility of sources is always interesting in journalism.
Not available for interview. December 4th, 1945, Red spies paid for jet secrets. Agents of the Communist International not only tried to steal secrets of the atomic bomb, but bribed technicians and engineers to furnish blueprints of military equipment, including jet-propelled airplanes. The New York Journal American learned today. They learned it that day. This is basically the P-59. It turned out to be the
The P-59, right. Yep.
P-59, right. And so shortly thereafter, Shevchenko departs.
Yes, that story came out December 4th.
December 4th, right?
That date rings a bell. It's my daughter Kate's birthday. So Kate, they... No, but they knew it was coming, so they... Yes, that was December 4th when the story came out. He was deported on January 3rd. But it's interesting to note that the Soviet government allowed Shevchenko to go Christmas shopping, to enjoy the holiday season with his wife in New York City. Only a few years before that, Stalin had recalled almost the entire staff of the consulate in New York City to Moscow and had them all assassinated. That was his form of human resource management. Gentle fellow. So the price of failure for a Soviet espionage agent was instant death, or that's if they were lucky. Otherwise, it was torture, then death. Yet they let him run free around New York City. He was given complete control of the espionage budget that had been set aside for him to just go Christmas shopping. Because what Soviet agents did when they were recalled to Moscow on good terms, they shopped in the West, took things home, and sold them for 10 times what they paid for them and got rich going home from civil service. So the idea there was they probably tailed him for a month to see if they could see who his contacts were, because they believed he had flipped, which would have been deadly.
Was there a time when now Shevchenko knows he's got to depart? He's going to exit the United States. The gig is up. But he makes a promise. Put that into perspective.
The original working title of this book was The Threat. And you heard Kay use the phrase, they wanted to get me in the worst way. When Shevchenko realized that his friend, in quotation marks, friend Larry Haas had betrayed him, he said, you made me look like a fool to my countrymen, and I will get you in the worst way. I think the language is a little more flowery than that, but the threat was what followed Kay and her father and their family for years and years to come, eventually resulting in her own mother's death. She was a tool to be used of coercion against her father. The rest of the story about Larry is how he became probably the most powerful nexus of military, industrial, scientific information and intelligence in the Western world for at least 2 decades, completely under the radar. That's why he's never been known. But you'll see when you read the book. you'll see when you read the book the incredibly detailed network, spiderweb around himself of influence that he created for himself. It's a fairy tale, a storybook that I think a lot of intelligence agents would like to be able to replicate. But he had the mind for this.
On January 2nd, 1946. And again, this is a time frame where we keep talking about, we lived, all of us, in a Cold War time period. When you talk about Russian spies, we knew they were here, but they were the bad guys. Up until that time, 1942 to really 1945, the Russians were the allies.
Yeah.
So much so, that they were kind of co-counsel, if you will, at a thing called the Nuremberg trial, which affects somebody you probably never heard of, Robert Jackson, part of that world. I had to drop that in. I'm required to do that.
That's good. You do it very well.
At some point, yeah. So anyways, it's the story as you read it, you have to kind of constantly remind yourself that we're talking about counterintelligence and counter-espionage, counter-spy with an ally. That was unprecedented.
It absolutely was, because you're not supposed to try to convict your ally of knifing you in the back. That would be considered bad manners, to say the very least. Somebody said, just recognize that the Soviets were strange bedfellows. They really were. And Hoover was one of the few people who really, really saw that coming. But when Hitler invaded Russia, Operation Barbarossa, I think it was 2.7 million men in arms stormed across the Russian borders in one day. It was the largest military invasion in the history of the world, and betraying Stalin. So naturally, the free world had to come to the rescue. But in one 24-hour period, Hitler's forces just about decimated the Soviet Air Force, which at the time was the largest air force in the world. Not the most modern, but it was huge. And so Stalin actually went into hiding for, I think it was 3 weeks after that invasion. But finally it took a long time before he addressed the Russian people. And he said, the British and the Americans will understand what just happened to us. They had to fight for their own freedoms, for their own liberties. They will be our friends, and they'll come to our rescue. So a lot of Americans were definitely in sympathy of what happened to Russia, very much the way we're in sympathy for Ukraine now. And I think it's very, very easy to see history in that mirror, that what Mr. Putin appears to have done is he tried to reproduce what Hitler did to him, did to the Russians. And if you remember history, you remember Hitler's attempt at Anschluss when he wanted to annex Austria. Once again, the Russians learned from history so they can repeat it. They wanted to annex Ukraine. So we feel that this story is a kind of a lens through which it's not just history. This is a lens through which you can understand today's realpolitik.
Shevchenko is now on a ship off to January. I will not ask you to read, because you'll have to, I repeat myself, read the book, but it's really high intrigue. So Shevchenko's gone. Now, really, a lot of the book deals with his parting admonition, we'll get even.
Yeah.
And that comes in getting even with Larry Haas, and then it takes form of how to get even, seemingly through his eldest daughter.
Right. The eldest child is a very important position to be in that culture. So Kay became the agent through which they tried to get revenge and influence. Kay's younger sister, Judy, is only 2 years younger, but she was kept in the dark for years and years and years. And not until she was an adult did she even get the beginnings of the story about what was happening all around her. And by the way, I was trying very hard not to give a spoiler on what happened. Thank you. But it definitely, what happened was, we're hoping to see it from Hollywood one of these days. You may have noticed the picture out there of Kay and me and Lee with Ken Burns.
Minor film figure?
Minor film figure. So, but don't wait for the movie. Read the book.
Without getting into any detail, suffice to say, she talked about the fact that there were identified at least 7 attempts on her life. And you go into detail about that. Again, I won't ask you to repeat that. But as you have sat with Kay, as you've been verifying independently, what's been the biggest surprise?
That's a very interesting question. I would say the biggest surprise that as we researched more deeply, even Kay learned things about her father she never knew before. And his life was so complex and so carefully engineered, and I think if you knew him, it would have all looked effortless. I have some letters that he wrote to family members, and the letters themselves could be a sitcom. He had an incredible sense of humor. He was sarcastic. He was acerbic. He was a remarkable guy. And one of the things I felt best about it is, as we started to put this together, Kay said, "I think you got my father's personality in the book." And that was really what made me feel very good, because he is a remarkable person. So one of the biggest surprises was we simply learned about Larry Haas. I was not too surprised to see that today's Russians are no different than yesterday's Soviets, except they may even be worse. So I was never a devotee of history before, but I certainly have a different way of seeing the world today.
Larry Haas was part and parcel of the development, really, of the non-prop jet engine, which was really the P-59, which became such a pivotal part in history. And I see some folks from Lakewood up here who know stories about the P-59, so I hesitate to launch into that. But did you get a sense of his abilities, Larry's ability? As you researched, you're a scientist, kind of what made him tick to really be able to go from a milkman to a guy who took liberties with the truth and became ultimately an engineer through a lot of hard work?
The hard work part, I think, is what clicked for him, because he would take liberties with the truth, but only if he knew he could make it come out right. He was an honest con man, and I don't know any other phrase for it, but I don't think he liked to be around things that he couldn't understand. And if you're a scientist, the best place to be is you start from what you don't know. And ignorance is the perfect starting place, because you can't start from any place else. And then you build on that. He really, really enjoyed learning new things. And he really enjoyed meeting the people who were creating new knowledge. For instance, most of us here probably aren't aware that the United States at one point had a program to build an atomic-powered jet plane. The Soviets did. They flew it for a while, and it was a very interesting plane because it spewed fallout out the tailpipe of the jet plane. And that was not considered good form. Larry actually worked on a project in which he was helping to build what could have been America's nuclear-powered jet plane. I think we had the good sense not to fly the thing. But the Soviet pilots who flew it died of radiation poisoning, which is not good for pilots. John, you would probably agree that's not good for pilots, right? So he just enjoyed meeting the people who created new knowledge, like Oppenheimer.
The first counter spy. Why should these people buy that book?
Well, frankly, let me speak from the heart for a moment first, because I think Larry Haas was a man who the world deserves to know. And I think when Kay promised on his deathbed to tell his story, that became almost the feeling of a sacred trust. That was a story that had to be told. And I think it honors a good man and a good woman who lived through difficult times for our sake. So in that sense, I think it's a very valuable part of history. In addition to that, history really is a lens through which to understand today's world. One of the things that I learned throughout this is that I don't like the phrase fake news. That's just partial news. If you pick the part you like and make believe that's the whole news, you're creating a fake. But you have to know all sides to think you know the news. And if a newscast on television or radio was to tell the whole story of each headline you hear, it would have to be a 2-hour documentary. It's just not practical to give you the entire story. But it's up to you, if you want to think you know what's going on, to do the research behind the story. What we see in the news is a very, very plausible, probably true explanation of what's going on, but the depth is not there. It just can't be. Personally, as a journalist, I've taught journalism, I taught broadcast journalism. I don't like people talking about journalists as liars. We're not. Journalists that I know work very, very hard to uncover the truth and dispense it to us. There are outlets which take a strong stand on one side or another. The best thing to do is either ignore them or watch both sides simultaneously. If you want to get close to the truth, try very hard to deny what you believe and listen to the other side, and you might get closer to the truth. Thank you. Thank you. I would say, to go back to your question, that might be one of the greatest lessons I think we learned in this book. So read it and find out that there's, well, I'll just tell a little story from the book. If you go to Russia today, you will find out that one of the most useless things ever done in the Second World War was the 2 atomic bombs we dropped. They had nothing to do with ending the Second World War in the Pacific. The truth is that at, I think it was Potsdam, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War 90 days after the war in Europe ended. Well, 90 days after the war in Europe ended, Stalin sent his forces into China, and within a matter of days, Stalin's army wiped out the Japanese million-man army in Manchukuo. I think that was the name of it. Overnight, wiped out a million-man Japanese army. And you know your geography, how close China is to Japan. They could have practically waded across the water and taken over Japan. Well, then we dropped 2 atomic bombs. And in Russia, the story is the Russians won the war, and we were so terrified we'd lose the spoils of war, we dropped some bombs. So the emperor in Japan had a choice. Who will we surrender to? We could have surrendered to Russians, could have surrendered to the Americans. His choice was who would be the most humane victor. It was America, clearly. So it's rare in history that the defeated get to choose the victor. So you really have to understand both sides of that story to know what really happened in the Pacific at the end of the Second World War. So.
Final word. This is your chance before they rush to buy your book and get your autograph.
Keep an open mind when you listen to the news, and please do your due diligence, do your research, listen to both sides. Neither side is all right, and neither side is all wrong. Just because somebody doesn't agree with you doesn't mean they're idiots. They might be in their own right, but that's not what proves the point.
Ladies and gentlemen, Walt Pickett.
Thank you.
Two things. 1. Book signing, buy the book. And he will sign it, and while the line queues up, if you don't want to wait in line, go downstairs, because you know what? There's food. It's fantastic. Thank you all for coming. It's a great crowd. You've been spectacular. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.
Good job.
That was a lot of fun. That really was. Thank you.
Good job.